to tell you the truth, when I sent the abstract to Timothée, I thought, well, I have worked on normativity, I have worked on reproduction, it's going to be easy to think of the normativity of reproduction. No, I don't have an answer. I don't have a proposal. I will say something about it, but I don't. Maybe I will tell you why I don't have one. But I start saying very briefly what I think of normativity, following like everyone today, Georges Canguilhem. As people this morning, Timothée and Sebastian said. For Canguilhem, organisms are relational beings. He says this in his Le Vivant et son Milieu. One must understand that the relationship between the organism and the environment is the same as that between the part and the whole of an organism. So it's really a very important relational way of understanding normativity, which I think has three axes. One is I think someone said this morning, but the self-construction and the regulation of parts to form an organism, to form the living organisation, the relation of the organism and the milieu, which generates values related to preferences of organisms, and norms are not static, but they have a developmental or ontogenetic trajectories, which are punctuated by events such as disease and recovery. Because I always think on the ontogenetic trajectory of organisms, I normally think of the normativity of the norms as restricting the environment in a very Goldsteinian way. But you were talking in a much more optimistic way of thinking, or norms that can be more creative or perhaps even expanding the environment. I think that Canguilhem thinks in a very Nietzschean way in the beginning. We can everything, and he thinks that you can less and less in your life. But this is not the topic of my talk. So what I want to follow about after what I said is that in this article, which is very important for me, Vivant et son Milieu, he contrasts the tradition that considers the environment or the milieu as the surroundings of an organism in a very relational way of the organism, and well, he rehearses the different positions about what the relations of the environment and the organisms have been for different authors. But when he arrives to Darwin, he says that Darwin doesn't have anything to say about the organism-environment relationship or the concept of surroundings. He says, the fundamental biological relation in Darwin's eyes is the relation of one living being to others. It prevails over the relation between the living and the milieu conceived as an ensemble of physical forces. The first milieu an organism lives in is an entourage of living beings which are, for it, enemies or allies, prey or predators. I think that Canguilhem says this in a very derogative way, so Darwin is not useful for us, but I also think that he's wrong, I think that this is really a challenge to think of normativity. That is, that a view that only considers organisms and their relation with the surroundings in a very isolated and individualistic way is not enough to understand the living realm, and that we need this kind of focus or tradition as well. So I would have said that, well, in very, very naive ways, there was, everyone says that in philosophy there was a parting of the ways in the end of the 1920s when Cassirer and Heidegger were in Davos talking about Kant. And I would say that something of that kind could have happened perhaps in biology around the middle of the 19th century, when within a very few years, Darwin published his Origin of Species, and Clovenard published his introduction to
Study of experimental.
The study of experiment. Thank you. To experimental medicine, and one of them follows a very, very interdependent and connective way of understanding life, of organisms interacting among them, whereas Bernard is, I would say, the one of the most important figures of the organismal tradition. And it's interesting that they don't quote each other. They probably don't know a lot of each other. And all the ideas that, for example, Yogi has been saying about Rosen, saying that evolution is not important. Francisco Varela, in the Principles of Biological Autonomy, he says the same, that more or less using similar words, that evolution, that we don't need evolution to understand life. That's not my position. I think that the two of them, I like evolutionary biology a lot, but I like the idea that we can introduce organismal thinking into evolutionary biology, and I don't agree with biology that excludes evolution. Maybe Dobzhansky's motto is also wrong, but well, this is my idea. So. In this sense, the topic of reproduction has been uncomfortable or largely ignored in organicism and in organizational, many organizational accounts, partly because it is the main topic, perhaps because it is the main topic of Darwinian evolutionary biology, where it acquires a very primary explanatory status over self-maintenance or survivor, so it is sort of left to the enemy. And but some work has started in evolutionary developmental biology to try to understand reproduction. So my problem is, what is special about reproductive normativity? And well, I will try to convince you that reproductive normativity goes beyond individual organisms, beyond their autonomous organization and the relations, individual relations with the environment, because it generally involves other organisms, at least in sexual reproduction, probably in asexual reproduction as well, but I will not discuss that. And the problem is then, can there be a collective normativity? This morning, you are Conrad, you were asking about whether other organisms exist in this kind of, and you were thinking on social, perhaps you were thinking on social normativity. You know that, like Charles has mentioned, for example, George Canguilhem hated the idea of saying that the society is like an organism that has norms, because he saw there a danger of totalitarianism. And I also don't like the idea of assuming that just abstract social organizations have normativity, but we can discuss that. These are more or less the topics. I will go quite fast on some of them because otherwise I will not be able to finish. So, in the beginning of the usage of the word self-reproduction or even reproduction, it didn't mean procreation, or it didn't mean the production of new organisms, but the idea of reproduction was regeneration, for example, of limbs, or also McLaughlin says that the word self-reproduction system was just used to portray organisms which, because they are changing the materials all the time, they are self-reproducing. They reproduce themselves in themselves, or something like that would be the idea. But later, little by little, the term reproduction came at the beginning of the 19th century to have that main meaning of procreation, of production of new organisms. Like he says, McLaughlin, the term reproduction was coined in the 17th century and became important for biology in the 18th century, but acquired its current restriction to propagation only in the early 19th century. So one of the first to use the notion of reproduction to understand the idea that organisms are produced out of others and not out of I don't know, inorganic matter or like the generative ideas of, for example, Aristotle, was Buffon. And for example, François Jacob has praised Buffon as someone who has first noticed that reproduction is the essential property of life, what distinguishes living systems and non-living systems. So this is, and in this case, reproduction would be linked to the continuous chain of organic beings or lineages. I will skip this and continue. But in a paper that we wrote with Charles Wolff, which has another version as well, but I have brought the first one, we distinguish two main traditions, the two main traditions, the organismal and the evolutionary, using, on the one hand, Manuel Amarela and François Jacob, on the other, as saying that to understand life, living organization is primary. This is the case of organismal authors, whereas reproduction is the primary. It's the case of Jacob and most Darwinian thinking after the second half of the 20th century. One of the problems of reproduction in the Darwinian thinking is that it has been related and defined in terms of fitness. The notion of fitness refers to an organism's ability to survive and reproduce, but in fact, even survival is in most works of Darwinian evolutionary theory of the modern synthesis. Survival is also understood in terms of that the organism's survival is significant to the extent that it enhances the organism's chances of reproducing, and passing its genes. So everything revolves around reproduction in this sense. But of course, I'm going to try to defend that it's possible to think reproduction in other ways, in ways that are more compatible with what I have been calling the organismal tradition. So to do a very, very fast review of conceptualizations of reproduction, I think that after 1953, the idea of reproduction, at least in Jacob's book and in many other Darwinian and molecular biologists' idea, is a formal transmission of a genetic program, and there is rooted the idea of the replicator, Dawkins, etc. I'm not going to talk about that. A very, very important discussion and criticism of the replicator comes with the idea of the reproducer by James Grismer that Yogi has already mentioned, because he says that in reproduction we have to have a material overlap between the reproducer and the reproduced, something that was before belonging to the reproducing system is going to be transmitted. And development, the reproduced system has to have developmental capacities to become an adult. Other authors later, even Grismer himself and others like Minelli, have been talking about even environmental supports of reproduction using scaffolds, things that are outside. For example, the way viruses replicate would be a scaffolded kind of reproduction. And we have been working in our group on relational reproduction, focusing on relations that make possible reproduction, that is the production of new organisms of a given kind, rather than on transmission of form or matter, taking into account all, but focusing on reproduction or on relations. Well, this is James Grismer. I'm going to pass. If you want to know more about this, you can ask me. I think everyone knows. I have already said something. And these are Peter Groff-Smith and Alessandro Minelli, who talk about the importance of scaffolds to understand some forms of reproduction. And I want to stop here because I think that in the Darwinian philosophy of biology, well, she's not a Darwinian only, but in one of the books that, some of the papers that she wrote on that, Evelyn Fox-Keller is one of the philosophers who has complained about the idea that someone can think that that organisms can reproduce by themselves and making copies of itself by itself, like she says in this quote. She talks especially of the need of mates, the need of other organisms in order to reproduce. So she is really not very keen on talking of self-reproduction. She criticizes the idea that reproduction can be self-reproduction, and then, well, as I said, we need the other resources and scaffoldings to understand, and also to understand that mostly, in our view, reproduction is a collective process and not an individual one. The kind of reproductive relations that we have taken into account are these: parent-offspring, parent and parent, ecological, the relations with the ecological environment, with the social environment, and the physiological environment. And one of my colleagues, Laura Nuño de la Rosa, has said that all the new trend in evolutionary biology, especially in the philosophy of evolutionary biology, of vindicating the idea that living entities are agents and not just passive objects being molded by natural selection, hasn't taken into account reproduction as a possible goal for agents. People have taken into account the relation of the agents with the environment, the idea that agents need to develop and are not just passive results of genes. They have taken into account many things, but reproduction has been neglected or excluded from those reproduction, and so reproductive agency, or like she says, or agencies, like I say in the two papers that we published last year, cannot be reduced to ecological or developmental roles, and reproductive agency needs to take into account reproductive goals that need perhaps to be interactive. But this is something that I'm not sure how to theorize. So most of the work that has taken into account relations in understanding reproduction in the framework of evolutionary biology has been rooted in the idea that everything is conflict, and that all kinds of innovation and novelties are going to come from conflict. I'm going to pass this. So in evolutionary biology, the main goal of organisms, the main goal is to maximize their fitness. Their agencies are always interpreted in this light of conflicting with the interests of other organisms, and trying to understand the evolution in those terms. This is, for example, a paper that was published around 10 years ago, that says that in sexually reproducing organisms, the genetic interests of individuals are not perfectly aligned. Conflicts among family members are prevalent, since interactions involve the transfer of limited resources between interdependent players. So the conflict is going to be between the sexes, between parents and offspring, and between siblings. This is the main idea for understanding reproduction as relational. And I will explain a little bit this idea of conflict with the example of the Etxeberria pregnancy, an example that we have worked in our group. Well, the idea of conflict is long, has been expressed a long time ago, and this is, for example, Rivers, a very important author in evolutionary biology, saying that if the embryo is not seen as a passive recipient of parental investment, but as an active actor, then we must have conflict at the heart of sexual reproduction. We have reviewed mainly two kinds of conflict in the case of pregnancy: genetic conflict and immune conflict. The genetic conflict has been especially worked by a Harvard biologist called David Icke. Maybe you know him. He says the so-called conflict hypothesis confronts the view of pregnancy as a cooperative interaction between a mother and her fetus, and points instead to the potential for conflicting interests between maternal and fetal genes. The genetic interests of mothers and embryos, understood as different individuals, are not perfectly aligned. So they see the evolution of all these relations, pregnancy and other kind of reproductive relations, as the result of resolving conflicts in those terms that are going to ensure that all the agents maximize their fitness, not in other terms. That is what we mainly criticize. So he sees the mother and the fetus as possessing an unequal genetic makeup, and then the interests are misaligned. And from an evolutionary point of view, fetal genes would have been selected to increase investment, so to demand investment from the female, while the maternal genes would have been selected to resist. This is the stereotype. And because half of the fetal genome is of paternal origin, the optimal amount of investment for the fetus is always higher than that of the mother, so that mother and fetus are predetermined to compete for resources. This is the idea. And sometimes they describe this in very Velic or warlike words, like mother and fetus interface is conceptualized as a battlefield, where the mother tries to contain the fetal invasion. I'm not going to elaborate on this, but we have worked on the idea that with respect to conflict, we can have at least one epistemological stance or as explanatory strategy. Perhaps it is interesting. And the other is the ontological commitment that the conflict exists, really. The second kind of conflict is the immune conflict, and this was traced back, this conflict traces back to the work of Peter Medawar, who in 1993 defined the immunological paradox of pregnancy this way, saying, how does the pregnant mother manage to nourish within herself for many weeks or months a fetus which antigenetically is a foreign body? So Medawar arrived to this paradoxical situation by drawing a comparison between the immunological circumstances of the embryo during his gestation and a semi-allogenic graft. So he was like working.
What is semi-allogenic graft?
It's like a transplant, a tissue that you transplant. So he was working with war-injured people, and he observed that most of the transplant of tissue for people who have been burnt or were rejected by the organism. But the thing is that this idea that the fetus was like that tissue that has been extremely influential to understand pregnancy, but it's completely wrong because it's very different. The relation that the female has with the embryo and the relation with a tissue of a random donor. This is something that Victoria Mail has been working in the last. In this paper is very recent, for 21 or 22, And she says that, in fact, between female and fetus, there is a joint immunoregulation, which depends on components. The immunoregulation depends on components of both the maternal and embryonic origin, and this makes possible some kind of collaboration. I'm going to call it collaboration, even if perhaps we don't want to use those words, but which allows the implantation and maintenance of the embryo in the maternal uterus in pregnancies with invasive implantation. Well, not all groups of mammals have invasive implantation, but the human species has a very invasive kind of implantation. So they both participate actively in the immunoregulation, so it's a very different situation from the one of grafts attached to the skin of an injured people. In fact, well, I don't want to spend a lot of time with this, but in fact, in the case of pregnancy, inflammation, which we normally understand as something which is quite pathological, has become a physiological resource for the possibility of pregnancy in humans and in other groups. Because if implantation produces, when the zygote attaches to the uterine wall, that is implantation, produces an inflammation, but it's important that it does, because if there's no implantation, there's no implantation. If there isn't an inflammation, there's no implantation. So the body has evolved to require that. So there is an immunoregulation. And labor is also produced by an inflammation. So really the immune system has been evolved to produce this kind of collaboration. And this is a difference that you can see in the different kinds of pregnancies of monotremes, marsupials, and ectherias, but I'm not going to elaborate on that. So we proposed in this paper that we can overcome the conflict view of pregnancy, thinking that pregnancy entails a full integration of previous female and subsequent fetus into a single processual individual with temporal boundaries, and this individual is established through topological and physiological integration and also with immune arrangements. I have 12 minutes, 15? 15. Okay. So the pregnant females and their embryos interactively modify their physiology, development, and behavior towards a shared goal of successful birth. And pregnancy has evolved to comprise a collective reproductive agency from implantation to birth as a major evolutionary innovation, because it provides this new level of collective agency. That is what we proposed in that paper about it. And I'm very briefly going to relate this with the history of discussions on conflict and cooperation, because we have in one paper embraced Kropotkin's legacy, not because this a political author defends that we are actually good people who collaborate, etc. Not because of that, but because as a biologist, he worked in a tradition of Russian biologists who think that life relations evolve. Not only individuals, but relations are evolutionary entities. So this is something that in which we are interested. This is an idea that he took from one of his teachers, Karl Kessler. The idea, and those life relations are not only of competence and conflict. They don't deny that there is competence and conflict, but there are also collaborations and mutual aid, like the title of his book says, including symbiosis. And also, I am interested on this tradition because I think that in evolutionary biology, it traces another way of thinking of conflict and collaboration that is not the kind of discussions that have been in the units of selection discussion, in which what we discuss is always how much of my fitness can I give away to another and continue evolving and don't be and don't disappear from the living world. So this kind of tradition of living relations in which we have also included the idea of holobions by Lynn Margulis or endosymbiosis, all the ideas of microbial communities are, I think, an important way of thinking of conflict and collaboration, which of course needs more philosophical and scientific work, but I think that is more promising that just continue doing mathematical models of fitness maximization. So our understanding of the diphtheria pregnancy was partly inspired in those ideas, and I'm not going to go into many details here, but we have recently worked on a new paper in which we talk about reproductive characters, all kinds of reproductive characters as being interorganismal. So not simply like some people in the conflict tradition say that there are two organisms which share an interest on certain trait and they have shared interests or shared traits, but we have tried to argue that in fact those characters could be perhaps studied in biology and in philosophy as interorganismal characters and do a systematics of those and we have and understand different problems. In this work, the idea that reproduction is these reproductive characters are embedded in an idea of reproduction that is organismal, that is relational and is collective, as I already have said. And then the reproductive characters would be those elements that are integrated into the organisms and serve specific reproductive functions by interacting with other elements of the same organism or with other organisms. So in the paper we distinguish two forms of relationality, intra-organismal, that is relations among different component parts of processes contributed to the maintenance and function of the individual organism and that have to do with reproduction, and interorganismal relationality, that interactions between individual organisms, between sexual partners for fertilization, or parents and offspring. Well, I think I have already said all this, but I would like to comment that this work, which we hope that it will be published soon, it has been nearly accepted with minor changes. Is an advancement in the conceptual development of a relational, organismal and collective approach to reproduction in Evo, because we discuss philosophical aspects of this and is quite scientifically informed. But one of the reviewers says that, of course, it is not based on already existing research, because, as I said, there isn't any. All the studies on reproduction that are focusing on relation are conflictual. And so they say this is an exciting paper that has the potential to become a classic of a nascent biological discipline. That is very hopeful thinking, I think. But naturally, the question whether these ideas can sustain an empirical research program cannot be assessed at this point, but at least the reviewers see the potential for that, so to be influential in biology itself. So I come finally to the issue of reproductive normativity. I come back to the problem. So many authors, as I said in the beginning of the late 19th century and throughout the 20th century, have argued that organisms are not independent of their surroundings, like I said that Kant says, and rather their processes are relational, being influenced by and also influencing their environment according to their needs. Consequently, the norms established by living systems, which guide their behaviors, must be understood as context sensitive, in that sense of the environment. I'm repeating what I said in the beginning. And for instance, this is Kangian's view, and the normativity of an entire life should be seen also as a developmental or ontogenetic trajectory that changes according to the relation with the environment, rather than being something which is fixed. However, this raises the question, so what happens to the normativity of reproduction if it is considered as a collective interorganismal process? Can we say that it's still individual, or is there another kind of system where the normativity stays? So when discussing the function of reproductive organs within the framework of the organizational approach, it is sometimes argued that these organs, that reproductive organs, gametes, semen, do not contribute to the individual biological organization. This is something that everyone accepts without saying anything, but I think it's really very, very controversial, because how can you say that those elements, at least in multicellular organisms, don't have a role? If they have a pathology, if they are diseased, you are going to die out of that. So they seem to think that the Weismann barrier of germ and soma is literally occurring, and I don't think it's true. But well, in any case, the idea is that these reproductive traits and activities such as gamete production, egg retention, embryo selection, etc., don't contribute to the self-maintenance of the system producing and maintaining them. That is, for example, what Mateo Mosio, Álvaro Moreno, and Cristian Saborido say in their paper on function, or organization and evolution of function, in 2009. Because they are not subject to the closure in any individual self-maintenance system. As I said, I don't think it is true. I think they may be subject to the closure, at least in some terms. But it's true that the reproductive function is interorganismal, so it really goes out of that. So the tentative proposal is to explain functional attributions of reproductive traits by appealing to second-order self-maintaining systems like ecological systems or lineages, or so something that is historical or something that is ecological. That is their idea. All these traits are functional because they contribute an organizational role, which is not relevant for the organism, but it is for other instances. Well, I'm not very convinced with this, because I think that the reproductive normativity of organisms must be also viewed as interorganismal or relational, and that if the goal of reproduction is organismal, it is very difficult to say that and also it seems circular to say that the reproduction of organism accomplishes a role in a higher level instance when also the reproduction itself seems to be determined by that kind of element. So I would say that, well, instead it requires a coordinated set of mechanisms within the collective domain of the relationships involved in the process. And what I think I would say is that conflict hypotheses should be avoidable, as they tend to focus on individualistic solutions, which can limit the recognition and development of alternative ontologies in evolutionary process. And I will finish soon. But and by broadening our perspective to include those diverse ways of understanding life relations in evolution, we can create more comprehensive and inclusive frameworks that go beyond the viewpoints. So our approach to pregnancy and to intraorganismal characters doesn't necessarily, we don't think we confront conflict and competence, which are probably very important to understand many life processes, but our proposal aims to find how those are overcome, not by mathematical models of fitness maximization that are going to be compatible with certain collaborations, like most of the solutions in population genetics have been doing, but by using disruptive innovation to understand better how those reproductive processes occur, rather than just reducing the solution to the solution of conflict in terms of fitness, as I said. So we think that the conflict hypothesis has, as I mentioned before, some consequences that are very bad, like, for example, stereotypes of male and female. Males are seen as active, females are seen as passive. Males evolve strategies of manipulation and control, whereas females evolve resistance. Mating system consists in mate-mate conflict for access to female resources. Also, the view of the evolution of reproductive modes as arms races between embryos and mothers and males and females is not very interesting. And in some, the perpetual antagonistic evolution of the same species perhaps is not the only way to understand reproduction. In this sense, for example, this author, Patricia Brennan, who actually, she works in a very classical evolutionary, Darwinian evolutionary framework, but she has studied conflict between males and females in some birds, aquatic birds, and she has found that females are systematically forced to copulate, but something that no one had looked before at was how the morphology of the genitals of these birds has acquired a very, very convoluted way, so that it is really difficult to fertilize the female, and also the females have certain sacs to keep semen from fertilization, apart from other kinds of mechanisms that can be, for example, embryo selection or dietary. Well, all this is, of course, still conflictual. I don't deny that it's in the conflictual framework, but at least this Patricia Brennan and other female researchers are looking at new ways and new evidences to understand reproduction better. And I think that the female turn in reproduction perhaps can contribute to this, to understand and to resist certain philosophical ideas. And this is, I think, my last. So, to finish, our approach to pregnancy and interorganismal traits doesn't necessarily preclude conflict and competition. Instead, we aim to understand how these challenges are overcome through novelties or disruptive innovations as explored in evolutionary developmental biology or in ecological frameworks. For example, in the case of the pregnant female Eutherian, we would say that the normativity of reproduction is easily conceived as something that belongs to the individual encompassing female and fetus. So that's a very easy, if we convince you of our analysis of pregnancy, that would be a very easy solution. Other times it's very difficult. So the perspective goes beyond merely resolving conflicts in terms of fitness, seeking for a deeper understanding in the transformative processes involved. And well, I have worked on this with David Cortés García and Laura Nuño La Rosa, And some of the papers that I've shown are also co-authored by Mikhaila Pavlichev and Charles Wolf and others. So this is it. Thank you.
So I really think that you make a good case where uterine mammalian pregnancy could be explored under the light of vital normativity if we adopt something similar to Agiriano, right? In the sense that it could be creative normativity in the making, so to speak, right? These two organisms coming together to establish new norms about developmental trajectories, right? We refer to norms as developmental trajectories. But I'm wondering if it also puts some tensions into the framework, right? Because norm breaking, for one part, implies death, and for other, it doesn't necessarily so, right? A pregnant female, if it undergoes a miscarriage in the mammalian realm, doesn't necessarily has its life in risk, whereas the fetus or the embryo really does. So I do feel that there's some sort of asymmetry. Even though there is shared normativity, there is still asymmetry of the elements in play. So I don't know how we could really reconcile this from a perspective of Agiriano, or if you think that maybe...
Are you thinking of miscarriage which is voluntary or involuntary?
I'm not thinking about humans, I'm thinking about in general uterine mammalian pregnancy. This is what I said, not necessarily the human case, which complicates everything, but in general, uterine mammalian pregnancy, which is what we argue in one of the sections of the talk.
Yeah, but maybe it's for the interest of the group or the female. If, for example, the embryo is not viable, or I don't know, you see a problem in the framework.
No, not a problem. I'm just asking, how do you see it? Do you think that there will also be some tensions? Because clearly there is organismal normativity to organisms coming together as this processual individual, as you call it, with shared normativity, but the outcomes of the process going badly are not necessarily symmetrical for the parties involved.
Well, I think the outcomes can be bad for both of them, but the normativity, when we talk of normativity, someone has mentioned today, we are talking of systems, living systems that are precarious. So, dying or being injured or disease is something that is always, or starving is something that is in the framework. Yeah. I mean, I don't have to defend the normativity of pregnancy saying that the process is going to be perfect. It's only a kind of theoretical framework to understand how pregnancy can be viable without thinking that it has to be conflictual necessarily. But the rest of the precariousness, of course, stays there.
Yeah, thank you, Arantza. I loved it. I think you are into something. I mean, this paper, I agree with the review. I told you before I knew about the review's response. I like it very much in different scales. But I want to pick up on the conflict with Monsieur Toll's conceptualization of normativity and everything, because I think that's like productive. The conflict there is, maybe the collaboration is productive. Because I agree with you. And in fact, one interesting way of phrasing the conflict or the tension there is that if reproductive functions belong exclusively to a higher order organization, then and normativity and closure are the foundation for teleology. How is it possible? Well, I assume that it will be a corollary of the theory that the system that has the intention to reproduce or satisfy this function will be the collective or the higher order. But certainly, I feel sexual urge, and it just is is absolutely internalized, even if it doesn't contribute to my self-maintenance and everything. So there's clearly a way in which we can embody norms that are relational, and I don't think Matteo and company have resources to explain that. So I think it's really good. Just wanted to celebrate and maybe, and here is a problem as well.
But I don't think that I have expressed a good solution either. I think that the solution is not so abstract like a second order kind of entity. No, because it's too abstract to think of the ecological system or the lineage.
Yeah.
But of course, the normativity of this kind of variables and relevant figures can be discussed. But
Just one potential danger, and I want to open a conversation with this line, because it could be also dangerous to assume, maybe only with humans, I don't know, but still, conflict one, that if I have certain organs and relational bondings and embodied urges and teleological incorporations of, for example, reproduction, and I don't reproduce, I am doing something wrong. Am I not being a complete being? And this has been a classical topic in feminism as well, and hopefully also in new male thinking. Are we complete if we don't reproduce? And I don't know, maybe just that makes any.
I think we are learning more and more, and as I said, I agree with all the organismal tradition that reproduction is not the primary goal of life. I think it's self-maintenance, but the reproduction is also important. I wouldn't base all life on reproductive capacity. I agree with you on that. But the thing is that if reproduction is collective, one of the things that we can learn is that maybe there can be some kind of procreation without each individual reproducing. So not everyone has to reproduce, and some. But I mean, even if they are agents of reproduction, so even if they have others, for example, sisters with their siblings, with their offspring, or grandchildren. I think that reproduction, if you consider it as a collective, done by many agents collaborating in different ways, not even with conflict, can be understood in ways that you don't have to say that each individual has to be.
Yeah, that's interesting.